Assalamu alaikum everyone, welcome back to the series of IGCSE economics, and today we are going to be looking at a very important topic of IGCSE, which is demand. And I would suggest you guys to focus on this chapter particularly, very important, particularly because this is something which is very important in understanding your macro concepts as well, and it is very important in understanding the intermediate concepts that we'll be studying in the later sessions. So understanding the market forces is very important in economics. And so let's begin. So what is demand? So we are talking about the demand for a commodity right now. Demand for a product basically refers to the willingness and ability of the consumers to purchase that product at various price levels at a given period of time. Ceteris paribus. Now what ceteris paribus is, you guys can ignore that for now, because I would be covering this in another video explaining what the assumption of ceteris paribus means. But in essence, the demand for a product basically refers how many consumers are willing and able to buy that product at the given price. And remember that thing, that these two characteristics, that is willingness and ability, both of these are important to be present there in order for something to be counted as demand. If one of these characteristics is not available, we say that the demand is not effective. For example, if I'm willing to buy a product, for example, a Gucci purse, but I do not have the income, the ability to buy that product, that won't count as demand. And on the other side as well, if I have the income, if I have the money to buy something, but I do not want to buy that good, that won't count as demand as well. So in order for demand to be counted as demand, willingness and ability both need to be present. So the next concept that we're going to be studying, and that we need to understand to understand demand, is the law of demand. So the law of demand basically states that at higher prices, less quantity of a particular good is demanded, and at lower prices, higher quantity of a particular good is demanded. So this basically says that there is an inverse relation between the price of a good and the quantity that is demanded in the market. So obviously when the prices rise, the quantity that people demand falls, and if the prices fall, the quantity that the people demand rises. Now moving on, before understanding what the graph of demand looks like, we need to understand how that demand curve is plotted. So before moving on to a demand curve, and to put things into perspective of what law of demand means, we need to understand what a demand schedule is. So a demand schedule is basically a table that shows the quantity that is demanded by the consumers at different price levels. So you can clearly see that at higher prices, the quantity demanded is lower, and at the lower prices, as prices decrease gradually, the quantity demanded rises. So that is a tabular representation of what a demand curve looks like, and why and with the demand schedule with us, we can now move on to plot the demand curve. So whenever we are plotting the demand curve, you guys need to understand that we take quantity on the x-axis and price on the y-axis. Now price is the independent variable when we are plotting the demand curve, and quantity is the dependent variable, because quantity demanded is in fact dependent on the price that is in the market. And a demand curve is always a downward sloping curve, which we can see. And if we plot different prices, we can clearly plot a relationship between the price level and the quantity, and it's a downward sloping curve. Now moving on to the factors that affect the demand curve. So we have two types of factors. One is what we call an internal factor, that is the price, and one are the external factors. Now before moving on to the external factors that affect the demand for a product, we need to understand how price impacts the quantity that is demanded in the market. So firstly, let's look at the concept of contraction in demand. So for example, if the price of a product rises, let's suppose that the initial price that is set in the market is $3, and the price rises to $5, there will be a movement along the demand curve. So that movement along the demand curve represents a contraction in demand, because your quantity demanded is falling. Now remember this thing, that whenever the price of a product changes, the demand curve does not shift. The demand curve remains at its place, and there is just a movement along the demand curve. So a contraction in demand will occur when the price of a product rises. And similarly, if price of a product falls, we have an extension in demand, because if the price falls from 3 to 1, there will be an extension in demand because your quantity demanded will rise from 120 units to 140 units. So that movement along the demand curve, downward movement along the demand curve, is what we call an extension in demand. Now, this contraction and extension will always happen if the price of a product changes. Now, remember this thing that if there is a change in the external factors, any other factors, there would be a rise and fall in demand, meaning that the demand curve will shift outwards or inwards. So let's look at what a rise in demand means. So a rise in demand means that at each price level, you now demand a higher quantity for it. And this can occur due to many reasons. And let's look at those. So the first reason is a rise in incomes and normal goods. So normal goods are basically those goods which have a positive relationship with income. So when income of people rise, people demand more of normal goods because now their purchasing power increases and they would be able to buy and afford more of those goods. Similarly, if a fall in incomes happen and the good is inferior, the demand for goods will rise. This is because inferior goods are those goods which are low quality goods and people do not prefer them when their incomes are high. So if the incomes of people fall, they would no longer be able to afford high quality goods. So as a result, they might be forced to switch to low quality and low quality output, low quality alternatives. And as a result, if their incomes fall and the good is inferior, then the demand for inferior goods will rise. The other reason for a rise in demand is population growth. Obviously, if your population increases, if the number of people in the economy increase, there are more number of people now in the economy who want the good, right? For example, if we talk about food, if the birth rate increase and death rate decrease, there will be a population growth. Or if population grows through any other reason, for example, through net immigration, if there are more people coming into the country, the demand for food products will rise, and as a result, the demand curve will shift outwards. Another reason for a rise in demand is a rise in the price of substitutes. Now, substitutes are those goods which are alternately demanded goods, which satisfy the same need or want. So, if the price of another substitute product, for example, if the price of Coca-Cola increases, then people might switch to other fizzy drinks, replacing Coke with other ones, right? So if the price of a substitute increases, the demand for your product will increase because now your product is relatively cheaper compared to the other one. So moving on, a fall in the price of complementary goods can also lead to an increase in demand for your good. So complementary goods kya hote hain? These are jointly demanded goods. Now jointly demanded goods can be, for example, cars and tires. So if the demand for cars and if the price of cars fall, people will be buying more cars, and if the price of cars fall, people will be demanding more tires because now they would be buying more cars, and more cars would mean that the demand for tires will increase. So if there's a fall in the price of complementary goods, the demand for your goods will increase. Next factor that we have is expectations about the future prices. Now, what does that mean? For example, if you expect that the prices of a good is going to rise in the future, it would mean that you would be willing to buy more of that good in the present than in the future. So if you feel like that, if consumers feel that the prices of a good will rise in the future, they would start buying that particular good today rather than the future. So demand for that good today will increase. And lastly, successful advertisements can also lead to an increase in demand. So if your advertisement is successful, you will be able to better persuade the consumer to buy your good, and as a result, the demand for your product will increase. Moving on the contrary, we have a fall in demand. Now, what does a fall in demand means? That now at each price levels, consumers are willing to buy less of the commodity that's out there. So a fall in demand is basically caused by the following factors. Now there's a bit typo here. This arrow would be in the other direction. So so all those factors that we have discussed, if those reverse, then the demand for a product will fall, and the reasoning remains the same. Now that we have discussed about the individual demand, we need to understand the difference between what individual demand is and what market demand is. Individual demand basically refers to demand for by a consumer for a single product, whereas the market demand is the total quantity of output that is demanded by all the consumers in the market for that particular product. Let's understand this with a mathematical example. So let's suppose that we have three consumers in the market, and let's assume that in a market there are only three consumers: Peter, John, and Harry. Now, now we are given all the individual demands of those people, okay, how much they are willing and able to buy at each price level. So the quantity that will be demanded in the market would be the horizontal summation of all the individual demands. So the quantity of the market would be the quantity demanded by Peter, the quantity plus the quantity demanded by John, plus the quantity demanded by Harry, and that would give us the market demand. And that is how market demand is derived from individual demand curves. Now, the only concept that is left in this is how the market demand curve is derived, and that inshallah we'll be covering in the next video.